from St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. We're nearing the end of a year in Missouri, Illinois, and St. Louis politics that delivered leadership change and palpable legislative acrimony. This year also marked the return of President Donald Trump, who pressured both Missouri and Illinois in directions that provoked public backlash. And while this was an especially busy year in politics thanks to the never-ending stream of news events, St. Louis Public Radio's politics team sifted through the deluge to bring you the top stories that affected Missouri, St. Louis, and Illinois politics. We're going to start with Illinois. This year featured skirmishes on multiple fronts between the state's Democratic leaders and Trump. And the past 12 months also provided a glimpse into the near future of political leadership for a state where Democrats dominate. Joining us now to count down the top stories in Illinois politics is Will Bauer, STLPR's Metro East reporter. Will, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Good to be here. Before
we get to the top five, a couple of honorable mentions, and I guess that includes Sonia Massey's killer, Sean Grayson, being found guilty of second-degree murder. Will, Massey's murder provoked national attention primarily because it was caught on video. Why do you think the result of that trial meant something in 2025?
Well, two reasons. Pretty simple. I think it's another instance of a white cop killing a black person. And then also, number two, we know through some of our reporting partners at Capital News Illinois that Sean Grayson would have had quite a few problems before the killing of Sonia Massey. So, yeah, it definitely generated lots of attention. They actually had to move the trial from Springfield, where the crime happened, to Peoria.
The other honorable mention I want to mention is no mid-decade redistricting in Illinois. How grateful were you, Will Bauer, that you didn't have to deal with that, given that the impact would have almost certainly been felt in the Metro East?
I guess, I appreciate the job security, but yeah, we have enough news already. But yeah, it would have been a really tough task, I think, for Illinois Democrats to further gerrymander that 14-3 map, 14 Democrats, 3 Republicans. And yeah, a good chunk of two of the 3 Republicans that represent Illinois in the U.S. House touch the Metro East in the 15th District in Mary Miller and the 12th in Mike Boss. So I would imagine to get that down to a 15-2 map, you would probably have to combine a few of those. That would have made it an interesting primary, like there kind of was with Mary Miller, and I'm blanking on Rodney Davis.
Rodney Davis.
Thank you. So yeah, no, I guess we're glad that we already have enough news, right?
So let's get to the top stories that made the cut. At number 5, it's been the chaotic year at Granite City Works that eventually led to a blast furnace at the massive facility being turned on. Will, given how much steel production means to Granite City, how stressful was this year for that town?
I think really stressful is the answer, and I wanted to bring in a list just so I could recall everything that's happened this year, and I'm going to quickly run through it because it was a bananas year for them. So you start out with Joe Biden. Then President Joe Biden, start of the year in January, blocking the deal. Trump says the same, and the deal is off in February. But in May, the deal's back on because the Japanese, the new owners, Nippon, promised investment, and they agreed to allowing the Trump administration to have a member on the board, and also they have veto power. This is what we call the golden share. So in June, the deal closes. New ownership says we won't cut production for 2 years. We learn in the SEC filings, Security and Exchange Commission filings, that everyone is protected. All the mills are protected until 2035, except Granite City Works only protected until 2027. That's where we get those 2 years from. And then the Japanese announced in September that they're going to quit processing steel in Granite City. And the Trump Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, says we actually use the golden share to keep them from completely closing it. A couple weeks later, U.S. Steel says, actually, we're not going to stop processing. And then just this month, we learned that, oh no, indeed, they are going to restart the blast furnaces that had been turned off in late 2023. I know that was a lot, but I think that speaks well to your question. It was a bananas year. So much happened.
Number 4 is Governor J.B. Pritzker's decision to run for a third term. Well, I'm just going to be blunt here. I don't see any scenario where Pritzker loses to a Republican next year. The big question is, when does he announce he's running for president in 2028, and how viable is he against what's expected to be a large Democratic field?
Yeah, he's definitely on the short list of all the contenders that you could compile. But yeah, how does he stand out from Gavin Newsom of California, Andy Beshear of Kentucky, Gretchen Whitmer, Pete Buttigieg, Wes Moore, all of those? I don't know. That'll be a really interesting thing to watch. I think for us here locally, maybe the more interesting question is what Republican wins the GOP nomination, right? Is it Darren Bailey, who's kind of been the de facto leader of that party since he won the nomination in 2022, or Ted Dabrowski, who's running, who's maybe a little more pragmatic and fiscally conservative, kind of that classic old school Republican mentality? I think that'll be pretty interesting. But yes, whether or not they have a chance, especially in 2026, should be a pretty good year for Democrats. Historically speaking, the party in power doesn't do well.
At number 3, we have former House Speaker Michael Madigan being found guilty and sentenced to 7.5 years in prison in West Virginia. This was probably a very sad moment for my mother-in-law, Jan Todd, who is a former Madigan constituent who really liked the Chicago Democrat. But what was the reaction among other Illinois Democrats besides my mother-in-law?
There was a lot of people saying, we are trying to move forward, maybe putting a little distance in between them and the now guilty former House Speaker. So yeah, there was a lot of, we've also created a new Inspector General. There's been some reporting out that Inspector General doesn't have enough investigative powers. And of course, the Republicans would have said, we widespread condemn Michael Madigan and everything that happened during that era. And most recently, just this month, the development came that Madigan has filed paperwork asking for a Trump pardon.
Number 2 was the ICE raids in Chicagoland, which went on for weeks in the summer and fall. I understand this didn't occur very close to the Metro East, but when you talk about why Trump's approval ratings on immigrations have declined, it's probably because of the tactics used in Chicago. What do you think?
I can only talk about what I know, and I think, simply put, the fear is pretty widespread among those communities. We've only had a couple of instances locally where this occurred, nothing like the scale of the Chicagoland area. Fairmont City sits in between East St. Louis and Collinsville. It's a majority Hispanic town, and that town's mayor has spoken about how fear keeps the community from, doing everyday activities, simple stuff, going to the grocery store, going to school, and whatnot.
And finally, the number 1 story of 2025 is how U.S. Senator Dick Durbin decided not to run for another term.
The decision of whether to run for re-election has not been easy. I truly love the job of being United States Senator, but in my heart, I know it's time to pass the torch. So I'm announcing today that I will not be seeking re-election at the end of my term. The people of Illinois have honored me with this responsibility longer than anyone elected to the Senate in our state's history. I'm truly grateful.
Will, by the way, that was Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois who will not be running for another term in 2026. Will, Durbin is a Metro East native, specifically in that he was born and raised in East St. Louis. His successor is likely to be from Chicago or the Chicago suburbs. How do you think that will affect how the Metro East gets funding and attention?
Well, I think the assumption is that downstate had been pretty well represented in the Senate. Durbin's predecessor, Paul Simon, was also from Southern Illinois. But I think there's a good chance, right, that it's one of the Chicago area Democrats that is running for that seat, which that's not a seat that comes open often, so there were a ton of really competitive candidates that jumped into that race. And I think that will be a challenge for them is, will you have a ton of downstate offices, and will you remember the Metro East, Southern Illinois in your ventures as a U.S. Senator?
What do you think Durbin's legacy in American politics will be when he retires?
Longevity. He's been around since 1983 in Congress, was elected to the Senate starting in 1997. He's the number 2 Democrat behind Chuck Schumer. And I think his long service in Congress has been tainted for some of the Democratic Party because he has voted to fund the government with Republicans this year, specifically to end the government shutdown. So that's part of it. But he's also chaired the Judiciary Committee, so he would have overseen a ton of appointment for federal judges. And in terms of legislation, he would have been an author of the 1987 legislation that would have banned smoking on airplanes. He was a big advocate for protecting children of undocumented immigrants from deportation. We would now know that program as DACA. And then also, in terms of legislation or policy, rather, he is a staunch Catholic who has supported abortion.
In our last minute or so, Will, what are going to be some stories you pay attention to in 2026?
Well, it's an election year, as you know, and I think it'll be, really interesting, especially given that in Illinois, right, pretty uncompetitive state.
On a statewide level.
On a statewide level when we get to the general election in November. But in March 17th, we're going to have the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate seat. That'll be competitive. I think the GOP nomination for the governor's race may not matter in November, but that'll be pretty competitive. And then also the 13th congressional district represents a majority of the Metro East. Nikki Budzinski currently occupies it. That's as competitive of a district that we have here in the listening area. So Budzinski's got a challenger on the left and also a Champaign County board member running on the Republican side of the ticket too. So that's always something. That's always a district that could be competitive, so we'll pay attention.
And Will Bauer, St. Louis Public Radio's Metro East reporter, will be paying attention to all the happenings in the land of Lincoln. Will, thank you for joining us.
You bet. Thanks, Jason.
When we return, we'll count down the top 5 stories that defined Missouri and St. Louis politics in 2025. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. One of the things I contemplate often is how Missouri politics is rarely dull or boring. But 2025 may have proven that it is possible to provide too much news in the Show Me State to properly digest. That's because the list of top stories in Missouri and St. Louis politics could have been endless, especially since leadership transitions and national pressures produced an infinite amount of stories to follow. But thankfully, STLPR's wise and award-winning politics team sorted out the nonsense and coalesced around 5 stories that define the last 12 months. And present now to present those stories is Rachel Lippmann, STLPR's justice correspondent, and Sarah Kellogg, STLPR State House and politics reporter. Sarah, Rachel, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here.
Good to be back, Jason.
Now, as I mentioned, there were a lot of things that did not make the cut this year. Rachel, one of the things you included was St. Louis County Executive Sam Page's indictment for how his office sent out mailers for a failed proposition around the firing of county department heads. Why did that make your list?
Well, Jason, I think this is something that gives his political opponents, whether it is those on the council or those who are likely going to be running against him either on the Democratic or the Republican sides in 2026 for that office, a cudgel to beat him over the head with, just raising questions about his ethical responsibilities. And kind of more broadly speaking, if Sam Page is convicted of a felony, which some of these charges are, it could not only mess up his political career, but his medical career as well.
Sarah, you selected the reemergence of a state board overseeing the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, which is definitely a major news event, but one that didn't pass with as much acrimony as we were expecting. Why did that make your list?
Well, to be fair, Jason, this was the third or fourth year of them trying to pass this. So there was acrimony the last couple of years, and it had a lot of Democratic pushback. But I think what put it over the top this year was Governor Mike Kehoe putting that on his priority list. And I think that kind of was the final nail in the coffin for the issue. And Democrats knew that they wouldn't be able to basically push back against it anymore. But I mean, it was under a state board before. It was returned to local control through voter approval. And now it is yet back again under state control. So I think it's definitely going to be an adjustment.
Another story that made your list, Rachel, is St. Louis County's budgetary woes finally coming to a head, a storyline that is going to be massive for Missouri's most populous county going into 2026. Why do you think that story made an impact?
I think, again, it goes back to council realizing that Sam Page is fundamentally pretty weak, not only in his relationships with the council, but potentially politically going forward. And I think there is also a recognition that the time does have to come to eventually fix the structural problems ongoing in St. Louis County. And they were able to not only coalesce around the opposition to Page's budget, but then to also coalesce around a solution solution for that budget.
One of the stories that made my list of top stories was the resignation of Attorney General Andrew Bailey to become Deputy FBI Director. That led to Catherine Hanaway becoming Attorney General. I guess the reason I picked this was Bailey was a major player in Missouri politics before he was appointed to this post, and he could become a major national political figure if Kash Patel is inevitably ousted as FBI director. Rachel, I say inevitably because it seems like there's a new scandal every day with Patel. Do you think it's possible that Bailey could eventually take his place?
I think it is possible. I've also think I think a lot of us are shocked that Kash Patel has survived the scandals that he has currently survived. So we will see. I don't think it is inevitable, but I think it is a strong possibility.
I also want to say, Jason, that it just is a continuation of the Attorney General of Missouri kind of being a revolving door, because the prior two Attorney Generals became U.S. Senators, and now we have one that becomes the co-director of the FBI, or Deputy Director of the FBI. And I think that it's interesting that it is this position that seems to be a springboard, and we'll see if the current Attorney General, Catherine Hanaway, seeks re-election. I know she's going to, and actually serves a full 2 terms, because that hasn't happened yet.
I would honestly be a bit surprised if she is seeking something other than the Attorney General's office. She's had her time up in Missouri politics, becoming the first woman Speaker of the House, etc. I think she stays the full 8 years in office.
We did ask our listeners about what they felt the top stories of 2025 was. Friend of the show, Reese Ellis, picked the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill in Washington, D.C. He said the expansion of RECA, which is a compensation program for people who became sickened due to radioactive waste exposure, is a big freaking deal that took over a decade, and it created some interesting alliances like Cori Bush, Josh Hawley, Just Moms, STL, and Missouri Coalition for the Environment. And 2, changes to Medicaid will have an outsized effect on the state budget and what remains of our rural hospitals and nursing homes. And everybody understands this is a watershed moment. Sarah, what are your thoughts on Reese's choice?
I think it's a great choice in big part because of the Medicaid changes. You know, the FRA, which is the federal reimbursement allowance, is going to be affected, and that funds a third of Missouri's Medicaid expenses. So that's a big freaking deal. And I think that it's going to, if it's not addressed properly, that's going to blow a gigantic hole in Missouri's budget. And we're already looking at, smaller revenues this year, and who knows in the future. So I think that's just going to, in the future, just have a ginormous effect.
Especially if they are able to, which is unlikely, as we will discuss later, but perhaps get the income tax repealed in the state of Missouri.
Carolyn Bollinger wrote, a top story would be the rush to have data centers in Missouri, but not assessing the environmental and utility impacts. Maybe this would be story number 5 of top 10. Rachel, I actually firmly agree with Carolyn that the rise of AI and the controversies over things like data centers are going to become like one of the biggest issues in the country. What do you think about data centers even influencing St. Louis city politics?
I think you are certainly going to see a discussion about whether and where data centers should go in the city of St. Louis, especially with North St. Louis. Paul McKee controls a heck of a lot of land up in North St. Louis. You've got the NGA up there using a lot of AI. What is going to happen to some of the land that he controls? And will the Board of Aldermen be able to respond fast enough to put any zoning restrictions in place, or decide how they want to either incentivize, which is a possibility, although not great, or limit their growth here in the city?
And perhaps my favorite response to my what is your favorite story of 2025 prompt came from former St. Louis Alderman John Collins Muhammad. Just happy I wasn't in it this time. Collins Muhammad, of course, went to federal prison after a bribery scandal in 2022, but is now out of prison, and I genuinely hope he's doing well.
All 3 of the individuals caught up in that are now out of prison.
All right. The number 5 story of 2025 is St. Louis Sheriff Alfred Montgomery's many legal and political woes. Rachel, there's almost too many things to really list out here. Long and short of it is, Montgomery is in jail right now, could end up losing his job. Were you surprised he faced so much turmoil?
I mean, when the stories first started coming out, they just felt sort of, oh, this individual is quirky. You had the rolling of the dice, and you could spin that as I'm trying to diffuse the situation here. I think when he started directly not being willing to do the duties of the office is when things began to get a little more serious. And the incident in which he took former jail commissioner Tammy Ross, into handcuffs when he does not have law enforcement authority, probably sealed at least the introduction of a quo warranto proceeding.
I think it was Montgomery's response that really caught my attention, the response to all the turmoil, particularly what he said right here in this interview with St. Louis Public Radio's Brian Munoz.
Every single thing is a lie. It's misleading. They're misleading the public with false news stories. They're misleading an individual. And as someone who is a voter of the city of St. Louis, I would be upset. I will be mad and angry that an individual will go through this extent to try and attempt to overthrow a government office.
That was St. Louis Sheriff Alfred Montgomery responding to St. Louis Public Radio's Brian Munoz about what allegations from the Attorney General's quo warranto case were untrue. Rachel, Montgomery went to prison after that interview. I don't know how the AG's case against him will shake out. And I'll be very candid with you. One of the reasons why this frankly didn't make my list is the fate of the St. Louis sheriff, to me, is not a particularly big thing for the city.
Wasn't on my list either.
Can you talk about how this office with so little power created so much drama, and maybe there really aren't that many broader lessons to take out of this?
I think the broader lesson to take out of this is for voters to understand what the office actually does. This is not an office that has the authority to shape jail policy. This is not an office with any law enforcement authority. Now, their officers can get post-certified. That means they can be a sworn law enforcement officer in the state, but they don't have arrest powers. There are 3 duties: transporting prisoners, serving documents, and providing security for the court. So I think understanding what the job is that you elect a person to and evaluating individuals through that lens. Jason, you like to say this about the circuit attorney's office. The sheriff's office is something we shouldn't even be thinking about.
No, and I think we've thought about it quite a bit this year. And now would be a good time to mention that we are recording this interview on December 15th, and it is possible news regarding Montgomery will happen by the time this airs. Just want to put that out there.
It still doesn't change my take on the situation, but that is true.
Understood. At number 4 was the end of the 2025 Missouri General Assembly session, which included Republicans passing measures aimed at voter-approved paid sick leave and abortion initiatives. Sarah, we were both in the Senate chamber when this happened. How do you think the melee at the end of the year affected this year in Missouri politics?
I think it kind of showed the hand of state Republicans where it comes to what voters vote on, a bit, and whether or not only if they respect those decisions, but whether or not they believe voters knew what they were doing. An excuse, or basically what I've heard from Republicans a lot, is that voters were tricked when it came to Amendment 3. We have both talked to Republicans, enough Republican voters that we don't believe that is true. We do think that people knew what they were voting for when it came to legalizing or overturning Missouri's near total abortion ban, and as well as the amendment or the Proposition A, which, kept the initial minimum wage increase, but did strike the mandated paid sick leave pretty much, the immediate session after it was funded. And that was done through, again, it was a proposition, not an amendment. We'll see if that happens in the future. But I think it's going to, have an effect of, I don't know if I'll see in the next couple of years any more propositions. I think that's because it is much harder to overturn a constitutional amendment, and it's not too much more work to get it be a proposed amendment instead of a proposition. I don't know if I'm going to see one of those if the legislature is just going to turn around and overturn it, or at least portions of it. So I think that's a big effect that it's going to have in politics. And I also think that the way this was done, which I know we will talk about, Jason, which was the previous question, which is a motion to end debate that doesn't really happen in the Senate. The frequency of which those were done at the end of session as well as a special session, I think is showing the attitudes over in the Senate and how that is going to affect how Democrats and Republicans work with each other or not with each other in that chamber.
Sarah, you read my mind, because our next clip is from State Senator Stephen Weber of Columbia predicting what would happen in 2026 if Republicans went ahead, as they did, to cut off debate on the abortion and paid sick leave initiative legislation.
And I know it's a long summer and I know it's a long fall, but I tell you, I've been trying to get to this chamber for 25 years. So to me, 7 months are nothing. 7 months are nothing. And so next year, when you don't have a consent bill, next year when you're sitting on this floor listening to me talk about the NBA and talk about my feelings and talk about things that I thought of on the drive down here, I don't want you to wonder why. You can be mad. That's fair. But you can't ask why, because you know why. And you know, every one of you knows what we were willing to do, what we were willing to put ourselves through, what we were willing to give up to keep this place functioning. And the majority party is choosing not to do that.
That was State Senator Stephen Weber of Columbia on the final day of the Missouri Senate session on May 14th. Sarah, Rachel, I'll turn this to both of you. Do you think Republicans should be prepared for a very bad session in 2026? Rachel, first to you.
Absolutely. And I think most people in and around politics at any level understand and are aware of that.
Sarah.
Yes. And I also want to reference that what Senator Weber was referring to is what Democrats were willing to do. That was surrounding Proposition A, because they spent many hours negotiating that bill, ultimately for no negotiation to happen in the long run, which I think was very, very frustrating for Senate Democrats. We are going to see how dysfunctional that building is. And I thought the last couple of years, I will say last year was, I thought, turning over a new page, and it feels like it's going to be worse than it was in the prior years. This will be my 5th session. I do think it's going to be maybe one of the least productive yet, unless this marks a new beginning, or at least a temporary change for the Missouri Senate, depending on who's in charge, which this will be the second year for Senate President Pro Tem Cindy O'Loughlin and Floor Leader Tony Luetkemeyer, a majority leader. We'll see if they don't care, and we'll see if that leads to more previous questions to cut off debate. But also, they have to pass a budget, and they've needed Democratic votes those last couple of years. So we're just going to see what happens. I do not think it's going to be a very happy place.
At number 3 on our list is Kara Spencer upending Tashara Jones as mayor of St. Louis. This race wasn't even close, either in the primary election or the general election. And for Spencer, the race came down to widespread concern St. Louisans had over basic governmental service.
This campaign was built on the simple idea that St. Louis can do better. St. Louis can get back to the basics of better delivery of city services that our residents and our businesses rely on. All right, am I right? But this campaign, this election was about so much more than potholes and trash. It was built on the idea that we can build a downtown that we can our region, the St. Louis region, can be proud of.
That was St. Louis Mayor Kara Spencer during her victory speech earlier this spring. And we will talk more about what her victory meant for the city of St. Louis after this quick break. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. We're talking with STLPR Sarah Kellogg and Rachel Lippmann about the top stories in St. Louis and Missouri politics throughout 2025. Before the break, Rachel, the number 3 story was revealed to be Kara Spencer defeating Tashara Jones in the 2025 St. Louis mayoral election. Rachel, what do you think Spencer's election signified?
I think she was able to capitalize on what was a poor performance, not just necessarily in the city of St. Louis, but elsewhere, following the January snowstorm. Now, it was not the easiest snowstorm to deal with. A lot of municipalities had problems with it. Even St. Louis County, MoDOT had problems with it. But the city of St. Louis has always been somewhat disgruntled when it comes to plowing the streets and whether or not they get plowed. And I think there was the ability to capitalize on people have short memories when it comes to how the city handles the snow. They have expectations for how they want the city to handle the snow, even if it has never been the city's policy to handle snow in the way that they want. And it just came at the absolute worst time for the political election cycle in the city of St. Louis.
During her interview with us after she lost, Jones felt that her rejection showed the lack of trust that St. Louis voters are willing to provide to Black women in politics.
There is, I would say, an unhealthy and unrealistic level of expectations when it comes to Black female leadership, not only in St. Louis, but, when we look across the country. My dad always told me, and then it's an old phrase that Black women have to work twice as hard just to get half as much. Well, I feel like we work 5 times as hard to get nothing in return.
That was former St. Louis Mayor Tashara Jones talking about what her loss to Spencer means about the city's trust in Black female leadership. Rachel, does she have a point?
I think she does. I think more broadly about Black leadership in general. You have to look at the fact that the 3 Black mayors that have been elected in the city of St. Louis, Freeman Bosley, Clarence Harmon, and now Mayor Jones, all served 1-year terms. All of them had different issues, of course, that led to them only being single-term mayors. But yes, I think there is, generally speaking, perhaps, like she said, higher expectations. And I think some groups that really backed her and hoped that she could really change the thinking of the city were also dissatisfied with how she was doing. So they weren't as willing to go out and push for her and rally around her until it was a little bit too late. And you also just run into the inertia of city government in trying to change things. So you let those individuals down. And then, as we previously mentioned, the snowstorm let some of her not even supporters down.
The number 2 story of the year stays in the city of St. Louis, and that is the political and governmental response to the May 16th tornado. For full disclosure, this was my number 1 story of 2025 for reasons I will articulate later. But just for context, the tornado caused several $1 billion worth of damage, mainly in western and north St. Louis. As of now, the damage is not even close to being fully repaired, even in places with means. Rachel, can you talk about just how big of a challenge this was and is for the city of St. Louis?
I mean, the first thing you have to think about is that the amount of damage that this tornado caused is about equal to the city's budget for an entire fiscal year. That means they could throw every single resource at cleaning up and fixing this damage, but you would be dealing with then spending absolutely nothing else in the city of St. Louis. So just resource-wise, the city doesn't have the ability to recover on its own from this tornado. And as some of the alder people in the affected wards have told me, you're looking at repairing parts of the city that were already in, frankly, terrible condition. So you're trying to, on top of rebuild after a tornado, rebuild on decades of systemic neglect in some of these areas.
This tornado happened less than a month?
I think 31 days. Inauguration was April 15th.
And I would say there was a rally around the flag sentiment when it came to city politics. You saw people like Board of Alderman President Megan Green rallying behind Mayor Spencer's leadership, even though those two are not political allies. And Sarah, there really wasn't much disagreement in Jefferson City about helping tornado victims, especially since the legislature approved $100 million for the city, along with a number of other disaster-related items. But of course, getting to that point required some horse trading. Can you kind of explain how that came to be?
Yes, the initial amount that Governor Kehoe was asking for was a lot less. I believe it was $25 million. If it wasn't $25 million, it was 20. I'm sorry, at the top of my head, I can't remember. But that was supposed to be statewide for anyone who was affected by a disaster within like a couple months. And so that meant that everyone was going to be fighting over this smaller pot of money. But another reason why the legislature came back for this special session was to pass a package that aimed at keeping the Kansas City Royals and Chiefs in the state instead of leaving to Kansas or another state. And ultimately, Governor Kehoe needed Democratic votes for that bill. And so that smaller amount of money that was supposed to be for everyone became that amount of money, but also an additional $100 million specifically for St. Louis City alone. And so that did require, negotiation, but ultimately that bill that had the funding, they were ultimately that in the Kansas City. It wasn't specifically for the Kansas City Royals and Chiefs. Any football or baseball team could apply for it, but really it was for the Chiefs and Royals. Those bills were separate. The funding bill for St. Louis, the disaster relief, along with others, that passed with very, very, very little dissent, if any. So it was a very united effort, but it took a little bit of negotiations to get there in the first place.
Now, just because there was this kind of rally around the flag moment that I've talked about before, it doesn't mean that there was widespread happiness within the city. First of all, the sirens in the city didn't go off during the tornado, which really showcased the shortcomings of St. Louis's emergency response systems. Rachel, what did that failure show to you?
I believe it was called a cascade of failing events in the report that was written on this siren. Essentially, the long story short is that the individuals who are able to trigger the buttons when a tornado warning happens were not in SEMA's office. The individuals from SEMA understood that the fire department was supposed to have secondary authority to sound the sirens. Fire department wasn't aware that SEMA wasn't sounding the sirens. So the former city emergency management commissioner was eventually fired. And I think it just shows you got to get stuff on paper, make sure that everyone is on board, and also just physically upgrade the systems. We know that even if the sirens had sounded, some of them weren't going to work. And I think there is a case to be made that in some ways, Sarah Russell perhaps was a scapegoat for broader issues. Do I think them not being in the office when a known storm is rolling in? This was not just a pop-up. This system was known to be coming in. Not being in the office just in case something goes south certainly is an offense for which you can be disciplined. Is it a fireable offense? Is where I think you could make the argument that, yes, there was an element of scapegoating for long defunding or long underfunding this important agency.
There was also what many people felt was an underwhelming response from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, an agency that's facing a lot of challenges thanks to cuts early on in President Trump's administration by President Trump to staffing there. Here is Julian Nix, St. Louis's Chief Recovery and Transformation Officer, explaining how FEMA support fell short in response to the tornado.
I'm new to disasters, similar to most residents here in the city. And we were learning more around what FEMA was capable of doing and what they're not. And so one thing that we know we would have loved to see more, we never had a direct housing mission. So we never got support in this massive housing process that we're working through. We know we never got the disaster survivor assistance being willing to do the door-to-door knocking to make sure people got registered and got the resources that they need. And we also know they left really, really early from my point of view around the individual assistance support for residents. And so those are probably the three biggest ones that they could have been more involved on. I would have loved to see them been more involved in the demolition and debris removal effort from that standpoint immediately. And so there's a number of gaps that I would have loved to see our federal government play a much bigger proactive role in to support residents in this recovery.
That was Julian Nix, St. Louis's Chief Recovery and Transformation Officer, talking with me about FEMA's shortcomings in responding to the May 16 tornado. Sarah, given that the federal government appears to want states and local governments to be more responsible for disaster response, should we expect the legislature to do more to help the recovery effort in St. Louis in 2026? Or is the chaos in the Senate that we alluded to earlier going to be a real roadblock to a lot of recovery efforts?
Yeah, the answer is I don't know how much we're going to see from the state legislature as far as disaster response. These first of two special sessions this year, there really was kind of a notion of, this is a bigger issue. Let's put our differences and anger over how the legislative session ended aside because people need help. And it's not any less true that people still need help, but I'm not sure if there's going to be desire to continue to do disaster aid, in part because the legislature itself is looking at a smaller budget. It's looking at shrinking, possibly eliminating the income tax or finding other ways to reduce taxes. And I think that there was basically the House has a caucus called the Future Caucus, where they're looking at issues that will affect Missouri in years to come. And they actually had a hearing on disaster response where Mayor Spencer pretty much said, like, this is not something St. Louis can handle. We do need to maybe look at something for the legislature to look in, but I just don't know how much there is that they can do. The federal component is such a large component, and I don't think any disaster anyone can recover from that without aid from FEMA. So I think it's a very high ask, and I'm not sure if the legislature is going to consider that.
The reason I chose the aftermath of the tornado as the number one story is that the challenge that is before the city is just enormous, not only to rebuild structures, but also to create a sense of trust with African Americans who have felt for decades that the city has let them down. And I think that St. Louis resident Shahida Hudson sums up what a lot of tornado victims, especially in North St. Louis, felt in the aftermath.
It'll be left up to those of us who can still afford to be in this area to never forget and to remind them that we were alive when the response by the city and by the state left the neighbors and the community members, left the students, left the elderly to fend for themselves for a week while they passed the buck off to NGOs, churches, private businesses, large corporations. There were some large corporations that sent in whole flatbed trucks of blue tarps. Thank you to them. It wasn't their responsibility.
That was St. Louis resident Shahida Hudson talking with me outside her Wells Goodfellow home earlier this year. Rachel, given everything that's happened with the response to the tornado, do you think Hudson's sentiments are more widespread now?
Yes, and I think there is a real concern and a genuine concern and correct, not the word, I'm blanking on the word that I want to say here, but a concern that individuals are just going to be abandoned up there, and that developers are just going to come in and see their opportunity to even more further drive individuals out of that community. Individuals who want to stay but can't financially afford to rebuild in that area, or they're going to try and piece something together, not get the support they need, and then ultimately end up selling to people who just want to sit on that property for speculative reasons.
Okay, without any further ado, the number one story in Missouri and St. Louis politics of 2025, Missouri lawmakers try to redraw the state's congressional map. This was the number one story for both Rachel and Sarah. Rachel, why was this your number one story?
Because I think the ramifications and tendrils of this story are going to be much larger potentially than the tornado, because they could go federal. If Republicans retain control of the House, that is a story. If the Republicans don't contain control of the House, because the U.S. House, because they've drawn some of these other districts a little bit too close for comfort in a wave Democratic year, that is also a story. The ramifications are just sort of more broad and more national, I think.
Sarah, why did this story reign supreme for you?
I mean, Rachel stole my thunder a little bit there, I think, because
Sarah.
of the broader implications. But I think a part of it, too, is that this is not over. This is still ongoing. It has sparked several lawsuits that are currently going their way through the courts, the circuit courts. It's going to go to the Missouri Supreme Court, several of those. And I think that it's showing just how complicated this whole issue is, and the decision to whether or not the decision to do this was a good idea. I mean, we're looking at a map that in theory may not even go into effect, which we'll get into. But it's sparked a lot of anger from people who feel like their vote is getting taken away from them if you're in the Kansas City area. And I think, again, it reflects the different other states that have decided to do this or not. And I think it's showing a departure from norms, and you know, you're looking at a census every 10 years, and now we're looking at mid-decade redistricting that's not done, and now it has been. And so I think it opens a can of worms that we're going to see how often this happens, or whether or not it'll be a one-off. It remains to be seen, but I think it just has very, very large implications of not only Missouri politics, but U.S. politics.
The special session around redistricting was pretty wild, but I also want to just say that The run-up to the special session was pretty eye-opening, too, because Trump's staff was very aggressive in trying to get GOP legislators on board. Here's an example of that pressure from House Speaker Pro Tem Chad Perkins of Bowling Green.
Well, I was contacted by the White House liaison to state legislatures, right? And they told me it certainly was a priority for them for us to take a look at different maps and ask if we would be willing to consider it. And I think it's more popular than I realized it was, So
that was House Speaker Pro Tem Chad Perkins of Bowling Green describing how he received a call from the White House after he made a critical comment about mid-decade redistricting to the Missouri Independent. Rachel, do you think that all-out blitz from the White House just to get one more seat in Missouri will end up being worth it in the end?
I guess we'll see. They may not get what they want. It may not go into effect. And even if it does go into effect, they may not get what they want in a wave Democratic year. If Democratic voters are angry enough, looking at that map, I don't think it goes 7-1 Republican. I think it's a possibility that potentially for 2 years, and both of you who are more familiar at the state level will correct me if I'm wrong, there could be a 5-3, 4-4 Democratic map in the state of Missouri, which is about the opposite of what the Republicans were hoping for with mid-decade redistricting.
I think a lot of lawmakers, especially on the GOP side, did not anticipate how redistricting foes would gather more than 300,000 signatures to put the map up for a statewide vote. And there were clearly a lot of angry Missourians about this, including Jefferson City resident Frida Tucker.
I don't know what the answer is. I don't even like politics, okay? I just know we need transparency. We need to stop the power grab. We need, at least, we don't need to do it every 3 years, okay? Something's not right here. And it feels like racism. It feels like voter suppression.
That was Jefferson City resident Frida Tucker earlier this year at an anti-redistricting rally at the Missouri Capitol. The last question I have for both Rachel and Sarah on this, do you think the backlash over redistricting will manifest itself at the polls next year? Sarah, I'll start with you.
Yes, because we're not looking at only a backlash to redistricting. We're looking at a backlash to, as we talked about earlier, the repealing of the mandated paid sick leave of Proposition A. They're looking at challenging, again, Amendment 3 to try to reban most abortions. You're looking at that. I think voters in Missouri feel at least many of them do, feel very disrespected over the choices that they have made, whether it is who they are electing or the things that they are voting for. And I think it could prompt a very tangible backlash.
Rachel, the last word goes to you.
I think if they are able to stay consistently on message and make it maybe less about those individual issues where there may be some disagreement, you may not inspire only Democratic voters, but Republican voters as well, who may also agree with the sentiment of your voice is not being heard on important issues.
And I'll add one more thing kind of to add on to Rachel there. It's also a very easy strategy for Democrats in that one, where if they go to a district where maybe their district voted for Proposition A, but their representative didn't, boy, that's a pretty easy saying, well, you voted for this, but your representative didn't listen to you. I think that's a pretty clear message that they could hammer in several districts that are purple.
Sarah Kellogg is St. Louis Public Radio's State House and Politics reporter, and Rachel Lippmann is St. Louis Public Radio's Justice correspondent. Sarah, Rachel, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your incredible work detailing St. Louis and Missouri politics this year.
Always good to be on, Jason.
Of course, Jason. See you next year.
Today's episode was produced by Jason Rosenbaum.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.